Scan! Scan! Quick! Quick, get in!
Rachel, can you tell us about the work you're presenting at Venice?
So the work I'm going to show at Venice is called Spite Your Face, and it's a 30-minute long film which is going to be shown in Santa Catarina, which is a deconsecrated church in Venice. The film will be shown in portrait format, very large-scale projection, and it's a kind of dark Venetian fairy tale which is in part inspired by the fairy tale of Pinocchio, but kind of follows a character, a Pinocchio-like character, as he moves from one world, a kind of underworld, into a sort of utopian overworld.
Is it all going to be you, as it usually is? Are you playing all the characters?
Yeah. So as in my previous work, I play all the characters, so play a little boy and play kind of older, kind of more grotesque extras, play a kind of Virgin Mary-like sort of fairy character as well. And yeah, wearing kind of elaborate costume, and I got quite interested because I spent a bit of time researching in Venice, and the kind of colours and aesthetic of the work are less like my more recent work, which is quite pop-coloured kind of children's television, and more baroque kind of gold gilded. So it's a sort of more limited colour scheme, but still quite garish.
And how long did it take? You said you were working on the script a year ago in December, is that right? When you were actually in Venice?
Yeah. So it's really been since December that I started working on it, and it was kind of interesting time because it was just shortly after Brexit and shortly after the US election and Donald Trump, so it felt like there was a lot happening, and it was a kind of scary but interesting time to sit down and try and think some of these ideas through. And I think that's kind of where the sort of Pinocchio idea came in, and looking at ideas of truth and lies and how that's affected kind of political.
And noses grow, I presume, at points in drama. Right?
Yeah.
Do you, I mean, your films are always so incredibly lavish and kind of, the costumes are extraordinary. Do you have help creating the costumes, if not designing them?
Yes. So I worked with a few people making the costumes, which is really great, and I designed the costumes, and they kind of, I guess because I started making costumes in almost like a collage way of buying things and sticking them together and making quite baroque looking things out of quite cheap objects, sort of pound shop stuff. So there's still an element of there being stuff that's kind of shop bought and intended to look shop bought, but then with other bits added onto it.
There is a saying, film directors often say that they're more creative and resourceful when they have tiny budgets. Do you find that as your budgets or the commissions maybe get more generous, you bulk against this idea of being, of not having to kind of use serendipity or that kind of level of resourcefulness that comes from not having much of a budget? Yeah,
I think it depends. I feel almost like whenever you get a slightly bigger budget, you just make the film more ambitious, and you wind up almost in the same situation as you were before. But I'm not sure. I think there's been, this time round, it's been exciting in that I've had more people to work with, and really great producers, and much more help in post-production, which has enabled so much more in the way of kind of trying out different kinds of backgrounds. And I feel like it's still a limited enough budget to feel like you need to be resourceful.
Great.
Cold
set about with the timing, setting the timing of your films? This obviously has a narrative that maybe borrows from Pinocchio, so there is an arc that you're trying to follow. How do you make that decision about where you expect people to come in, where you expect people to leave the film?
With this film, actually, I was thinking quite a lot about that, and I've made it so that it's just a continuous loop, so the narrative has no beginning or end, which I quite liked as a kind of conceptual idea that I guess I've been thinking quite a lot about narratives and the way that so much of our identities, national identities, political identities are kind of formed through narratives, and this sense of a narrative which has no conclusion or no satisfaction. You never quite get to the end or feel like you're at the beginning. There's something about that I thought was quite interesting.
Quite pertinent, absolutely.
Yeah.
And fake news, there seems to be this slipperiness around, you know, how someone can define a fact, because there are so many other people redefining that fact at the same time.
Yeah. And I was kind of interested in the power of narrative, I think, a lot. If you think about the kind of Brexit and the referendum, the power of a narrative, and how if lies are told to substantiate that, often disproving the lie is not enough to really crack or affect the power of the narrative. That narratives have this kind of power within culture. So I was quite interested in looking at that, and there is a kind of rags to riches sort of narrative in the story, which is, I think, one of those kind of powerful narratives that feeds through so much of our culture.
But so much of what's happened in the last year, it's been about one side pitched against another and the violent arguments between them. Have you brought that into the sort of Pinocchio narrative? Or?
Yeah, I think there's, I guess, like quite a lot of my work, there's a feeling of a sort of binary, or there being two worlds. So the world within the film is a kind of a world above and a world below. And I was looking quite a lot at, I guess, kind of visions of heaven and hell, and almost a religious idea of an above space and a space underneath, and working with that in portrait format. So the world that the character is within, he kind of moves from the world below into the world above, and there's a sense of it sort of rotating and rotating back again. And I was quite interested in, I guess, dealing with this feeling of kind of inequality between the two worlds, and the sense of them being interconnected, and the sense of this kind of utopian world above maybe being on surface level utopian, but there being this constant paranoia that the world beneath is seeping in. And I think also in previous works I've kind of established a sort of binary, and often in the colour, and but with this film I was quite interested in also the kind of form of it. So the world underneath is all kind of non-linear perspective, sort of early, like medieval perspective, so sort of distorted scales, and that when the character passes into this world above, it becomes kind of clean, linear, mathematical perspective. So I kind of wanted to play with that sense of truth and how we understand truth within, in a visual sense as well.
Yeah, and that sounds like it's very much borrowing from the collaging you've talked about. The way you make films sort of is inspired by the collaging that you were making even in your early days as an art student.
Yeah, and I think green screen is kind of like collage in that way, and that what's fun about it is that you film the character and then you just chop them out, and you can do quite a lot in post in terms of deciding how you want to place them, and it gives you quite a lot of freedom after the film's shot.
I'm really intrigued by the idea you've discussed before about wanting to kind of repel and discomfort the viewer. I realised when I watch your films that I have quite a low repulsion threshold. I can take about 10 minutes and then I'm thinking, I'm not sure how much more of this I can take. Is that reaction good? Is it all good? I mean, as long as you've provoked a reaction.
Yeah, I mean, I think I like there being something seductive about the films, there being something kind of visually seductive or something that takes you in, and then there being moments where you're kind of hurled back out again and it's grotesque or disturbing, and I like that. And I think even in this part of this kind of utopian world I've created, there's this constant sense of something grotesque that's kind of seeping through the surface, and these kind of wounds keep appearing on the character's skin, as if there's just some kind of grotesque thing that's sort of pushing through. So I quite like that sense of a surface and then this feeling of something horrible that's pushing through.
Have you watched a lot of horror movies?
Yeah, when I was, I think whenever I was a teenager, they were quite fashionable. I don't know why. So it was like Blair Witch Project and Scream and that whole like era of, I mean, some of them are totally rubbish, but from filmmaking in terms of the way they manipulate you and the way they use sound, and they're often very formulaic, so I was quite interested in what actually makes you scared. And
yeah.
All that glitters is not gold, Vic.
And what about the elements of Scottishness? Do you feel like you're representing Scotland with this? Which, you know, obviously you are, but
yeah, I think this
how much of a factor was that?
Yeah, this film is less kind of specific to Scotland as other films I've made, but yeah, I'm interested in nationalism, and I think it's a kind of interesting time to be representing your country, and this kind of sense of a resurgence in nationalism across Europe, and these two very different experiences of nationalism in Britain, with kind of resurgence in British, English nationalism in Brexit, and Scottish nationalism, and the meanings of that.
Your script writing references are always very sort of rich, and I mean, I love the way in which It's What's Inside That Counts had so many fabulous lines that you felt could have been borrowed from an advert, but that you twisted. And
yeah.
Where did you draw inspiration for the Pinocchio related script?
I guess a lot of the scripts I write or I've only been writing scripts really for the last sort of 3 films I've made, and previous to that it was always found audio that was kind of cut up, and then I mimed to that on camera. So I've always, or at least I'm quite keen that the scripts allow me to play a lot more with language, but there's still that weird feeling that you get from found audio where you're taking things and splicing them together, and there's this odd kind of shifting between different genres, and there's odd senses of parody, and the scripts I kind of wrote with that in mind a little bit, so there's parts of it that feel very like an interview kind of format, and they're referencing, I look at a lot of interviews, or there's parts which feel kind of like a Disney musical moment, and that references a lot of Disney musicals, and I quite like the feeling of having a narrative like a fairy tale or something that's very well known that fixes everything else down. So with Pinocchio it's such a familiar story that you're able to take that as a starting point and then build other things around it.
And do you have a position? Do you ever sit and think what I'm presenting here is kind of very much veering towards one side or another, and I want to remain neutral, or do you feel you just kind of want to milk it for the absurdity or the colour or intensity, emotional intensity, rather than worry about the kind of allegiances you might be expressing through the tone?
Yeah, I mean, I think I guess in the past I've been wary of making, for example, in the Scottish referendum, I was wary of making an allegiance with the yes or the no campaign, in the sense that it's hard in that situation to make an allegiance without feeling like you're actually tying yourself to a political party and your view becomes much less nuanced. But I'm interested in taking a position with my work, and I think, I mean, a lot of the work this time round is kind of born of an anger, I think, an anger at Brexit, an anger at Trump, an anger at this kind of the rise of the alt-right, and an anger at kind of growing inequality in the UK and globally. And I kind of feel there's also quite a lot of commentary on kind of rising in misogyny and attitudes towards women, and I feel that it's a critique, but it's not, I don't want to align myself with a kind of major political party in the process.
But there's a hope, I presume, that people are going to take something away from that might either enrich their position or spark debates or get them thinking about, the issues in certain ways.
I hope so. I think, I hope in certain situations it changes the way that people experience a discussion, in the sense that a lot of political discussions happen within a certain kind of format, and art gives you this way of talking about the same issues, but sort of, at least in my work, kind of displacing it into this realm of the fairy tale and talking about these things within a kind of fictional narrative realm, which touches on lots of different kind of contemporary media, and also these sort of much older stories too. So I hope that kind of gives people a different way of thinking about contemporary politics as well. Yeah.